All right. As promised, I've got to move some stuff and make some room. But Betty White is coming back. Hey, this has been a long time coming, and she's coming back with a little more attitude. Let's get into it on this video on what it takes to build a purely performance-based FE, and and some of the costs associated with that. That's some information I've really never shared before. Always been a budget channel. This is not budget. This is pull money out, light it on fire, piss on the ashes, and wipe your ass with what's left kind of build. Yeah. Yeah, this is way off the norm for me. Way off.
I'd say he's a nut job.
All right, for those of you that have not been around, let me give you a quick history lesson. Excuse me, I've had a sneezing fit. I'll give you a quick history lesson on Betty White and where it came from. First off, I name all my engines. I always have. Betty White is by far one of the Betty White by far is one of the most watched and most asked about engines that I've ever had on the channel. I believe there is a real good reason for that, and because it truly, truly was one of the most budget friendly engines that's excuse me, one of the most budget friendly engines that's ever been done here. Anybody that knows anything about engines, different brands, types, and things, knows that the Ford FE is probably one of the more expensive engines to build. Probably one of the more expensive engines to even get parts for. So, budget and FE tend to get noticed. All right, so let's talk about the history of Betty White, where Betty White came from, and what I believe about why it became the most popular engine and video probably on my channel. First off, everybody likes an underdog and a true budget thing that makes you feel like anyone can do this. And Betty White proved that this is something that anyone can do. So we are talking 2022 here. And we were fighting for the points standings. We were fighting to be top 5. But hoping to stay in the top 10, if that makes any sense. But so we were at, I believe it to be London, Kentucky that year. We were in a pretty good battle for 5th in points. Had a decent little gap on 7th. We were sitting 6th, kind of comfortable there. But we had an opportunity to get top 5, which in the grand scheme of the way the Southeast Gassers worked was a little bit better as far as what you received than top 10. Although top 10, you did get you a nice little plaque and all, and get to walk across the stage at the banquet and all this stuff. But anyway, we were trying to get top 5. Well, we lost an engine at that race, and an engine that was pretty competitive, but it was done. It was toast. The way the point system worked with the Southeast Gassers is You get 10 points for showing up with your car. You get 5 points for each qualifying round you make, and they always had 2 qualifying rounds. Well, we kind of screwed the pooch when we lost the motor because we got our 10 points to show up, and the motor let go in the first round of qualifying. So we did take the beam, so we got 5 points there, but we was unable to go down for the second round, which means we didn't get those 5 points. So instead of getting 20, we got 15. So we basically lost 5 points to the rest of the field because they got those points. So we were to the point now where the gap opened up between us and fifth and made it look pretty difficult. The math says it was possible, but highly unlikely. What the real scenario was now is seventh place was within 5 points of us. So we were at risk of falling at that point. And I actually think in that time, I may be mistaken about this, seventh and eighth were tied. So we was risking dropping from fighting from fifth all the way down to like ninth in the points. Yeah. And if we didn't get something figured out, possibly falling out of the top 10. So if you go back and see the video series on where Betty White originated from, we stumbled across a Thunderbird with a 390 in it that honestly was scrap metal. It was actually headed to the scrap yard. You couldn't have got a good emblem left off this car. There was nothing left of it, but it had a lockdown 390. So if you go back and look at the video, we pulled the heads off of this thing, took a block of wood, banged on top of each piston to get the motor freed up, rotated the crank around till the piston was in the bottom of the hole, hit it with a dingle ball home, rotated around to the next one until we done all 8 cylinders, and just took an air hose and blowed the trash out of them. New head gasket, throwed the heads back on, throwed my intake and my MSD ignition back on it, and put it in the car. It had so much blow by that I had to zip tie the dipstick down into it to keep it from blowing the dipstick out. I literally had $150 in the engine. That was head gaskets, intake gaskets, oil filter, that may be it. So I literally had about $150 in this motor. We shot a coat of white paint on it, named it Betty White, dropped it in the car. The idea was that this engine needed to live one race to solidify my spot in the points. It did. We finished number 6 in the points. And the surprising part, and one of the things I think that really lended well to this whole aura around this engine, and the reason this engine has developed its own following, which is kind of weird that an engine develops such a fan base, but this engine developed a following, I think, was because not only did it run decent, it actually made a respectable time. Now, understand, when I say respectable time, we're not talking about this was not a full race engine. As I said, the blow valve was so bad on it that the dipstick tube had to be zip tied down in to keep from blowing out of the engine. So this was not a race motor. But in a car at that time that weighed 3,980 pounds, 4-speed with a 7-inch wide slick on the back, that engine ran 813. Naturally aspirated. I mean, if you know the Southeast gases, you know it's naturally aspirated and all. That engine ran 813. That is not really fast per se, but for a car that weighs almost 4,000 pounds, that's respectable for any engine naturally aspirated. But for an engine that had a kabillion miles on it, that was literally dingle ball honed, and you could see the rust line pitting and scarring in the cylinder walls where the rings were stuck, it made about 4 pounds of compression, and it I mean, it made the compression on it was so bad that when you was cranking it over, it sounded like a starter just sitting on a workbench running. You just got to and it would crank up. And it ran an 813. Not only did it run an 813, it ran 813 like a bracket car. Uh, the first pass it ran like a 812 with a 9, I think it was. And the second pass, it ran an 813 with a 1. It literally ran the same pass twice in a row. So even though the idea was that once it was over with, that motor was probably just going to get chunked, that it was no good. The fact that it ran so well, it was kind of like shooting a puppy. You didn't really want to get rid of it. You know what I mean? It got taken out of the car. The new engine got built, put in the car, and Betty White just kind of got tucked away under the workbench. And that's just where it stayed. We decided, we kind of made a decision toward the end of the season last year, November time frame, but we didn't really make it official in our minds after the first of the year that we probably were not going to run Southeast Gassers this season. And with that being said, we're not confined by any rule restrictions. So let's bring Betty White back out. Let's have some stuff done to the block. And let's see what we can do. Now, we have a lot of good parts to go into this thing to make the most power that it's ever made. And we're not restricted by any rules on what we can do with the suspension, tires, or any of that stuff. So now it's about, let's see how fast we can make it. We're going to do it bringing Betty White, our most popular engine, back. So we have just been solely using it for a track vehicle, and now we're going to transition it back to where it will be road legal. And then the ultimate goal is, of course, to do some drag and drives, but the ultimate goal is to take Melvin, the original owner, for a ride in his car again. Mr. Melvin's late 80s now, and we all know that life doesn't last forever. So, at least on this side. So, want to get it out there and take him for a ride in his old car one more time. But let's get into it. I've rambled enough. Let's get into this thing and let's look at the parts we're going to do, and let's go through this thing and show you how we'll put together a fairly healthy FE and how we're going to make it ultra competitive. At least I hope. Who knows? We're going to have to be faster than what we've ever been. All right, so let's get into putting Betty White together. And one of the things that is vitally important on the engine, any engine build, is your clearances and your tolerances. With that being said, I'm not going to tell you what you should set your clearance on. What I will tell you is that there is information online. Don't trust anybody else's numbers. Do your own research. But there is a formula that you can find. Basically, for every for the measurement of the diameter of the crank, for every inch, every number of that diameter, there is a number that correlates to that for a formula for the spec for your clearance. But the way you get that number, I will show you. So basically, you do the same thing you see me do with a lot of vehicles and all. You put it together to take it apart. And that's just how you get your tolerances. So what we're going to do is we're going to put all the main bearings in, torque all the caps down. Where they're going to measure our crank. Now we have an aftermarket crank. It is supposed to be correct, but don't trust anything. We're going to measure our crank. We're then going to measure the opening for the crank here with the bearings in it. The difference between those two numbers is your clearance. Now you need a certain number for your clearance. Let me say this by saying this. Always err on the loose side if you have to pick a side. If your clearance is supposed to be X and you measure it and it's close to X but it's a little off, err to the side of loose. Do not err to the side of tight. If your motor's a little loose, you'll know it. But if your motor's a little tight, everyone will know it. Tight scatters parts. You do not want it on the tight side. So I'm going to open my bearings up. I'm going to get my main bearings put in here. And then I'm going to torque all these down. Then we can start the measuring process. But this is the very first step to the process. This is the first thing we do is we get our clearances right. And then if we have to, I'll show you how we can change the clearances a little bit. Also, we measure every one of these, because if you measure every one of these and this one, for instance, is a little tight and this one's a little loose, swap these around and see if it brings it where it needs to be. You can play with them like that. And sometimes that's what it is. The caps are just a little variance and differences, and you can swap your bearings around, but you have to take your measurements to know this stuff. So that's the first thing we're going to do is get our measurements for our main bearings. All right, guys, I'm going to give you a little tech tip here. Now, keep in mind when I show these simple little tricks, I know a lot of you may already know it, but there's probably people out there that haven't done stuff like this and they may not know it. So I'm going to show them to you. To get these caps down there and on there, a lot of people just take a rubber mallet, pop, 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 or the wooden handle, pop, pop, pop. And that's fine. You can do it that way. But what happens a lot of times is when you bang on it like that, the bearing will fall out. Let me show you how to bang on it without banging the bearing out of it. Take two rubber mallets, take one, lay it on the cap, and take the other one, and there's no bounce that way. It just goes right down on there. And now all you got to do is just run your bolts down, torque them, and you're ready to do some measuring. Hopefully, that saves somebody a lot of trouble right there. That one little trick, it's something that I learned a long time ago. It's one of those things that is so simple, sometimes you just don't think about it. And if something like that is what I can do to help someone, then I'm tickled to death to be able to do it. So now I'm just going to run all these bolts down, get my torque wrench, and torque them all down. We'll do some measuring. Okay, we got all the caps in there. We measured the journal on the crank. Insert our gauge into the end of it and rock it out and back, hunt for that number. And it looks as though it's going to be pretty well right on what we want it to be on. Looks like it's right on it. Now, if you don't have those proper tools, it's best to let somebody that does do it. But You can also use these little spring gauges. You simply press them in, let them out. The hardest part about these is you've got to make sure you're straight in there. If you're not going to get a good measurement. Once you get them in there where you want them, you then measure what it says very carefully. Again, remember you're looking for a pretty tight number here. And you can find your number that way too. These are a little more aggravating just because it is kind of hard. They have a little tiny point on them, and you have to make sure you get on that point or you're not getting a true measurement. So they are a little more aggravating to read, but you can make these work. They're just not the best thing in the world to use. My eyes are not what they used to be. And trying to get these right on those nubs, a little difficult. We can live with that clearance. Either way, this right here does show just a little different than a bore gauge, but this right here isn't quite as accurate. But again, close enough to where we can live with. And of course, just for giggles, I will show you the Plastigauge method. It's not, again, my favorite method of use, but I will show it to you so you will understand. I had to dig kind of deep to find this stuff. I was starting to think I didn't have any of it on hand, but this is Plastigauge. If you look, hang on, trying to do this with one hand. If you look right in there, it's just a fine little piece of, I don't really know how to describe it. Let's think of like a wax rope. Just a fine little piece. You put it on there, tighten your main cap down, and then there's a gauge down the side of it. Whatever you're trying to read, and you line this up with however smashed it is, and that tells you your clearance. That is a very, very old school way of checking for clearances. I haven't used that stuff in so long. That's one of those things you use when you first start out and you start learning, and then you get better tools and you move on to better stuff. But I did happen to have some. So when I drop the crank in, I will use some of that, torque the caps down, and allow you to see how Plastigauge works. It is the cheapest way to check clearances. For a street motor, I wouldn't hesitate to use it. For a race motor, I'd want to be a little more picky than what that is. But I will show you how it works. I already know my tolerances now, so I will put that on there, torque everything down, and show you how to read it and what it reads. I'll also be able to kind of gauge how much difference it is between that and what proper tools are. Now this stuff right here is cheap. I mean, it's probably $1. May not even be $1, maybe less than $1. And it works, and you can use it for home building and stuff, and then you don't have to invest in expensive tools. I would say this: if you're just doing one engine to get your car or truck back up so you can get out and back to work, I'd use that and never hesitate. If you're planning on building a lot of engines, or if you're planning on building a performance race engine, I would spend the money to buy the proper tools to do it with. But ultimately, totally your decision. Trust me, as much as anybody, understands budget restraints. Is that not one of the prettiest crankshafts you ever seen? Fresh out of the box. Oh, man. Now the idea is we'll lay some Plastigauge here and here and here and here and here, and put the caps on and torque them down, and then we'll read that Plastigauge. Another reason I rarely use Plastigauge, I'm about halfway blind and I can't see that shit. Oh, where we at? Oh, I'm on the wrong one. That's right. Oh, I'm back here. Right there it is.
Can't operate the camera either. Right there it is. It's hard to see. Hard to see. All these torqued down. I just untorqued them. That's not the right word. I just loosened them all. Now we're gonna pull the cap off, and we're gonna look and see what the plastic gauge tells us. See what it says. All right. So now you can see how it squashed the plastic gauge, and then you take the gauge that's on the paper and lay in here, and you find the one that best matches what you're looking at. See, that one's too wide, too wide. That's about it right there. Could be that one. If it falls in between, I'll call it a half. Look at this one right here. Where we at? All right. Look here. Come back up here to this one. Let's see, because that back one was hard to see. Let's see. We'll say it's about right there. It's not quite that much. It's about right there. According to the plastic gauge, we have about 2.5 on our clearance there. Now, me personally, I run more clearance than on the FE bearing. But I will also say that it's slightly different than the actual tools we use. So, you know what I mean? Grain of salt. Again, you building a streetcar motor, I don't think it matters. I think plastic gauge would work just fine. Okay, I talked way too much today on history and clearances and tolerances and stuff that most of you probably do not care about. Most of you probably just want to see me put the engine together. So, entirely my fault. I got caught up in talking about how to set up the crank and main clearances and all that. Not a lot got accomplished today, and since I film with my phone, I really need to keep them about 30 minutes or less just to make downloading the videos not such an absolute pain. But what I will do is end this video, and then the video that I'll try to put up tomorrow will be pretty much us slamming the short block together, maybe even the entire engine together. I'll do less talk, more work, and get you some good content out there. If you want to hear the detail-y stuff on like clearances and tolerances and stuff like that, drop a comment down there, and I will try to keep that in mind and do that. But I figure most of you, I probably just bored you to death with this video. But it's one of those necessary evils that you kind of have to go through and do to make sure your motor is going to live. So basically today we've got the crank in Betty White. But that is the start of Betty White's revival and bringing her back. And probably going to have one wild motor when we're done with it, just because of some of the things we're doing. And I'll show you some of the parts that's going on this motor as we go through and put it together. It should be making way more horsepower than we've ever made before. Definitely more horsepower than this motor made the last time. It's going to be more cubic inches than this engine was the last time, or more cubic inches than we've ran in the Galaxy. So yeah, and it's going to have some really, really nice parts on it. It's no longer going to be a junkyard motor that we just freed it up and got it running. It's going to be a real engine, and we're going to try to squeeze everything we can out of this thing. We got a few little tricks we're going to do along the way. Those I may take time to share with you. But I apologize today for getting caught up in a lot of the technical stuff that a lot of you probably don't care about. Although the beginning, the history of
why Betty White is meaningful to us, I felt was necessary. So, with all that being said, please stay tuned for the next video. The next video will be definitely us putting that motor together. We'll definitely get that thing popped together in the next video, and just try to get through it as quickly as possible. And if you have any questions, you can drop them down in the comments. I will try to answer those questions as much as possible. They are a few things that I probably would not share, but I will share any information that will help anybody else. There's some things about this particular engine that I may not share, but I don't know, get caught up in a moment and tell you everything. But anyway, Betty White is on the comeback, and it is on the comeback for a couple of things. One, three things, I guess. One, we got some Flashlight Frenzy is what the series is called, race that we're going to do. It's a no prep race. There's 2 of those that we're committed to that we're going to go do. This thing should run really well for that. The No Name Nationals, that's really one of the things that we are hoping that it makes a great showing for, and we're hoping, since the No Name National is in September, that the idiot behind the wheel doesn't hurt the motor between now and then. And then, of course, in November, we're going to be doing the Southeast Street in Yeet, which is basically sick week or drag week or anything of that nature, but it's here in the Carolinas, North Carolina and South Carolina. So, which means we got to get the car street legal as well, but we don't have to have the car street legal until November. So, between now and then, it'll be dialed in, doing some tweaking and some testing. The motor should be sound and good for the season, as long as we don't hurt anything. This season is going to be about dialing in the rest of the car behind the engine, because this engine should be a very sound, very healthy engine. So, I'm rambling again. I apologize. Listen, I hope the Lord blesses you more today than He did yesterday. I know He sure does bless my life in many ways. Through all the health issues that I've had over the past year and all, He's really been good to me. So I hope the Lord blesses you more today than He did yesterday. Please remember to hit that like button, comment, and please share and subscribe. That helps us be able to do the things that we do. Help the channel grow. The more the channel grows, the more cool stuff we can do. But we're really about to go headlong into some racing content. And, of course, we've got to get this thing finished and done. But we're about to head long into some good racing content, some good race engine content, and some, excuse me, and get into the stuff that I figure most of you actually subscribe to the channel for, and that's the See the Go Fast stuff. So God bless you. Hope the Lord bless you today more today than He did yesterday. Thank you for each and every person who has subscribed. We greatly appreciate it, and we'll see you on the next one.
I'd say he's a nut job.